Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I am president of the City Club's Board of Directors. I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Julian Bond. In introducing a renowned leader who has made a lifelong commitment to the civil rights movement, economic justice, and peace, and who has been a spokesperson for the disinherited, I will offer just a few snippets on his life and accomplishments. Mr. Bond was born in Nashville, Tennessee, the son of Dr. Horace Mann Bond, a prominent educator who, among other accomplishments, served as president of Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. In 1957, Mr. Bond entered Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, where his classroom experiences included being a student of Dr. King. I think a lot of people say that, but he was actually a student of Dr. King. No surprise based on his subsequent life. While at Morehouse, he helped establish a literary magazine called The Pegasus, worked as an intern for Time magazine, co-founded the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights, a student civil rights organization that directed nonviolent anti-segregation protests that achieved integration of Atlanta movie theaters, lunch counters, and parks, co-founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where he became the committee's communications director, and worked in voter registration drives in the rural South, and while doing all of that, managed to earn a varsity letter in swimming. In 1961, he left Morehouse just short of graduation to join the staff of the Atlanta Inquirer, for whom he later became managing editor. Mr. Bond returned to Morehouse in 1971 to graduate with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English. In 1965, Mr. Bond was elected to a one-year term in the Georgia House of Representatives in a special election following court-ordered reapportionment, but House members denied his seat, citing Mr. Bond's opposition to the Vietnam War. Undeterred, Mr. Bond won a second election to fill his vacant seat, was denied his seat again, and then won a third election. Ultimately, in a case known as Bond versus Floyd, the United States Supreme Court overruled the Georgia legislators' refusal to seat him. Mr. Bond eventually served 4 terms in the House and 6 in the Georgia Senate. During that stint, he, among other things, co-sponsored or sponsored 60 bills which became law. In 1980, Mr. Bond began hosting America's Black Forum. He has been a commentator on the Today Show and narrated a number of documentaries, including Eyes on the Prize, PBS's award-winning production on the civil rights movement. In April 1977, he served as host of Saturday Night Live, where he performed a routine with Garrett Morris on the difference between African Americans of light and dark complexion. He also appeared in the movie Ray, featuring Jamie Foxx, and appeared as himself at the end of the movie, I'm told, with his hair dyed black. In 1998, Mr. Bond was elected to chair the NAACP, assuming the leadership position at a very difficult time in that organization's history. He has made no shortage of statements that have provoked debate, discussion, and controversy. For example, in commenting in 1999 on racism in the United States, he was reported to have said, quote, "Everywhere we see clear racial fault lines which divide American society as much now as at any time in our past," end quote. A prolific writer, Mr. Bond has a collection of essays published under the title, A Time to Speak, A Time to Act. His poems and articles have appeared in numerous newspapers and magazines across the country. He has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard University, where he taught civil rights and integrated the music of the era soul, rock, and protest into his course, Williams College and the University of Virginia, among many other institutions, and served as a distinguished scholar in residence at American University. He holds honorary degrees from over 20 schools, and that's just a snippet. I am honored and pleased to present on behalf of the City Club of Cleveland, Julian Bond.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm welcome. It's a great pleasure to be back at this forum once again. I was here some years ago, enjoyed it a great deal then. I'm sure I'll enjoy it again today. It's a pleasure to be here as well, to look out in the crowd and see some friends, some of whom will be acknowledged later. But I particularly want to mention Avery Friedman, who many of you know, who made it possible for my wife and I to visit Cleveland once again. And we enjoy visiting Cleveland because there's so many institutions here we just love. One of them, of course, are the many schools, the institutions here. We spent some time at Case Western Law School, both last night and this morning. And the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, of course, everybody loves that. The Hugo Boss outlet, how can you not like that? But I should mention one that many of you probably don't associate with me, but really is part of a family concern. My cousins are in a business which is the last one to let you down. You've heard of the Boyd Funeral Homes? Those are my cousins, and we're very, very proud of them. And we hope your acquaintance with them doesn't necessarily occur soon, but inevitably we know it will. Now, for most of my adult life, I've been engaged in what I might call race work, fighting to make justice and fairness a reality for everyone. The racial picture in America has improved remarkably in my lifetime, so much so that a black man has now been elected president of the United States, a development seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. But paradoxically, Barack Obama's victory in 2008 has convinced many that all racial barriers, all restrictions have been vanquished, and we've entered a racial nirvana across the land. I'm here to dispel that notion, and in the process discuss the challenges we face in the area of civil rights. There are those who say that race is history, and they have it exactly backward. History is race. The word America scrambled after all spells, I am race. And America is race, from its symbolism to its substance, from its founding by slaveholders to its rending by the Civil War, from Johnny Reb to Jim Crow, from the Ku Klux Klan to Katrina and Gina. It was 42 years ago this year that Martin Luther King was gunned down in Memphis. He's now been dead longer than he lived. This year marks the 55th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott. That's the event that introduced King to the nation and the world. He was then only 26 years old. At that early age and at an early stage of the boycott, King understood how historic it would be. 4 days after Rosa Parks stood up for justice by sitting down, the boycott began. That evening at the first mass meeting, he declared, when the history books are written in the future, somebody will have to say there lived a race of people, of black people, who had the moral courage to stand up for their rights. And thereby they injected a new meaning into the veins of history and civilization. Well, King did not exaggerate. Montgomery was the beginning of a mass movement that destroyed segregation and permanently changed our world. Thus, it's no coincidence that this year we also celebrate the 45th anniversary of the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And this year marks the 50th anniversary of the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960 that began a mobilization of black high school and college students, a mobilization that has not been duplicated since. It's almost 50 years to the date that I was arrested at the segregated cafeteria at Atlanta City Hall, and only a few months since the newly elected Republican senator from Kentucky said the law which ever since has protected me and others like me from being arrested again was wrongly decided. In 1963 alone, the year that King, fresh from the battlefields of Birmingham, told the nation of his dream at the March on Washington, there were more than 10,000 anti-racist demonstrations. The result was the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most sweeping civil rights law before or since, and one of Congress' finest hours. We look back on the years between Montgomery in 1955 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 with some pride. Those were the days when politicians from both parties supported the struggle for civil rights. Now they struggle to be civil. Those were the days when banks loaned money to people, not like these days when the people loan money to the banks. Those were the days we were powered by our values and not valued by our power. Those were the days when good music was popular and popular music was good. Those were the days when the president picked the Supreme Court and not the other way around. Those were the days when we had a war on poverty and not a war on the poor. And those were the days when the news media really was fair and balanced and not just mouthpieces for the misinformed. But those were not the good old days. In those days, the law, the courts, the schools, almost every institution favored rights. This was white supremacy. When the Supreme Court announced in May of 1955, in the second of two Brown decisions, that the white South could make hay slowly in dismantling segregated schools, I was 1 year older than Emmett Till. His death 3 months after the second Brown decision seemed much more immediate to me than the court's pronouncements had been. We were nearly the same age when he was murdered in Money, Mississippi for whistling at a white woman. His death terrified me, but in the fall of 1957, a group of young teenagers encouraged me to put that fear aside. These young people, the 9 young women and men who integrated Little Rock Central High School, set a high standard of grace and courage under fire as they dared the mobs who surrounded their school. Here, I thought, this is what I hope I can be, if ever the chance comes my way. The chance to test and prove myself did come my way in 1960, as it came to thousands of other black high school and college students across the South, first in the sit-ins, then in the freedom rides, then in voter registration and political organizing drives in the rural South. We joined an old movement against white supremacy that had deep, strong roots. Now, Dr. King was the most famous. He was the best known of the modern movement's personalities, but this was a people's movement. It produced leaders of its own. It relied not on the noted but on the nameless, not on the famous but on the faceless. It didn't wait for commands from afar to begin a campaign against injustice. It saw wrong and acted against it. It saw evil and it brought it down. Many stand now in reflection of that earlier movement's successes, including the election of Barack Obama, confused about what the next steps ought to be. The task ahead for us is enormous, equal to, if not greater than, the job already done. Today, we are 4 decades past the second Reconstruction, the modern movement for civil rights that eliminated legal segregation in the United States, and 14 decades past the first Reconstruction, the single period in American history in which the national government used armed might to enforce the civil rights of black Americans. 115 years ago, black Americans faced prospects eerily similar to those we face today. Then it was 30 years past Civil War and the first Reconstruction. The 19th century was winding down, and white America was growing weary of worrying about the welfare of the newly freed slaves, tired of fighting to secure their right to vote and to attend to public schools. Then, as now, a race-weary nation decided these problems could best be solved if left to the individual states. Then, as now, racist demagogues walked the land. Then, as now, minorities and immigrants became scapegoats for real and imagined economic distress. Then, a reign of state-sanctioned and private terror, including ritual human sacrifice, swept across the South to reinforce white supremacy. That's when the heavy hand of racial segregation descended across the region, a cotton curtain that separated blacks from education, from opportunity, but not from hope. As we recall these struggles of the recent past, many of us are confused about what the movement's aims and goals were, what it accomplished, where it failed, and what our responsibilities are to complete its unfinished business today. Looking back at that movement from today, we now see a very different view of the events and the personalities of that period. Instead of the towering figures of Kings and Kennedy standing alone, we now see an army of anonymous women and men. Instead of famous orations made to multitudes, we now see the planning and the work that preceded the triumphant speech. And instead of a series of well-publicized marches and protests, we now also see long organizing campaigns and brave and lonely soldiers often working in near solitude. Instead of prayerful petitions for government's deliverance, we now see aggressive demands and the ethic of self-reliance and self-help. We now realize our view of the movement's goals was narrow too. Seeking more than the removal of racial segregation, that movement did not want to be integrated into a burning house. Rather, it wanted to build a better house for everyone. It marched on Washington for freedom and jobs, not for abstract freedom alone. And instead of a sudden and unanticipated upsurge in black activism in Montgomery in 1955, we now see a long and unceasing history of aggressive challenges to white supremacy that began as long ago as slavery time. And instead of a movement that ended in 1968 with the death of Martin Luther King, we now see continued movement stretching from the ancient past until this moment, with different forms and personalities, in many places and locales, with differing methods and techniques whose central goal has always been the elimination of strictures based on race. The NAACP's founding in 1909 gave the movement an organized base. It soon developed an aggressive strategy of litigation aimed at striking down racial restrictions enshrined in law, triumphing in 1954 with Brown v. Board, ending legal segregation in public schools. That decision effectively ended segregation's legality. It also gave a nonviolent army the license to challenge segregation's morality as well. From Brown in 1954 forward, the movement expanded its techniques, its tactics, and its targets. Organizations and leadership expanded as well. When Dr. King came on the scene as the leader of the 55-56 Montgomery bus boycott, he articulated a new method, nonviolent resistance, of fighting segregation. The new method required direct action through mass participation. Reliance on slower appeals to the courts began to subside. In this period, gains were won at lunch counters and movie theaters, bus stations and polling places, and the fabric of legal segregation came undone. That movement then was a second Reconstruction, whose ripples were felt far beyond the southern states and whose victories benefited far more than blacks. Like the first Reconstruction, the second saw gains for blacks extended to greater protections for others. Like the first, it gave new life to other movements of disadvantaged Americans. And like the first Reconstruction, the second ended when the national purpose wavered and reaction swept the land. But before it slowed, it changed our country forever. A voteless people voted with their bodies and their feet and paved the way for other social protests. The anti-war movement in the 1960s drew its earliest soldiers from the Southern Freedom Army. The reborn movement for women's rights took many of its clues and much of its momentum from the Southern movement for civil rights. The movement's origins were in a bitter struggle for elemental civil rights, but it largely became, in the post-segregation era, a movement for political and economic power. And today, black women and men hold office and wield power in numbers we only dreamed of before. But despite impressive increases in the number of black people holding public office, despite our ability to sit and eat and ride and vote and go to school in places that used to bar black faces, including the White House, in some important ways, non-white Americans face problems more difficult to attack today than in all the years that went before. As long ago as 1964, the Republican Party had begun to remake itself as the white people's party, and they found a winning formula at the intersection of race and opposition to activist government. Conservative Southern Democrats became Republicans. Liberal Northern Republicans became Democrats. With last week's election, the Republicanization of the white South became complete. There is now one white Democratic congressman from the states of the Deep South. For much of the 1980s, America was presided over by an amiable ideologue whose sole intent was removing government from every aspect of our lives. One of the Reagan acolytes was named John Roberts. The memos he wrote while working in the Reagan White House contained racist and sexist jokes, but his approach to the law was no joke. He marshaled a crusader's zeal in his efforts to roll back the civil rights gains of the 1960s and the 1970s, everything from voting rights to women's rights. Today, of course, he is Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and he continues his crusade against what he has called this sordid business, this divvying up because of race. In January, his court, by a 5-4 vote, brought us Citizens United, the case that removed all restrictions on corporate spending on elections and therefore facilitated the anti-government and anti-regulation takeover of the House 10 days ago. The Roberts Court, in a cruel irony, observed the 50th anniversary of the Little Rock school crisis by gutting Brown v. Board, the historic case which gave birth to Little Rock and was supposed to end school segregation. Black and Hispanic children today are more separate from white children than when Dr. King was killed, the result of a systematic neglect of civil rights policy for decades, including fair housing laws. School resegregation also means that average black and Latino student is now in a school where 60% of their classmates are poor. I believe in an integrated America, integrated schools, homes, and schools. Integrated jobs, homes, and schools. I believe in it enough to have spent most of my life in its elusive pursuit. I think it a legal, moral, and political imperative for America, a matter of elemental justice, simple right waged against historic wrong. We are such a young nation so recently removed from slavery that only my father's generation stands between Julian Bond and human bondage. Like many others, I'm the grandson of a slave. My grandfather, James Bond, was born in 1963 in Kentucky. Freedom didn't come for him until the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1965. He and his mother were property, like a horse or a chair. As a young girl, she'd been given away as a wedding present to a new bride, and when that bride became pregnant, her husband, that's my great-grandmother's owner and master, exercised his right to take his wife's slave as his mistress. That union produced 2 children, one of them my grandfather. At age 15, barely able to read or write, he hitched his tuition, a steer, to a rope and walked 100 miles across Kentucky to Berea College, and the college took him in. My grandfather belonged to a transcendent generation of black Americans, a generation born in slavery, a generation freed by the Civil War, a generation determined to make their way as free women and men. Dr. King belonged to another transcendent generation, a generation born in segregation, freed from racism's constraints by their own efforts, determined to make their way as free women and men. When my grandfather graduated from Berea in 1892, the college asked him to deliver the commencement address. He said then, "The pessimist from his corner looks out on the world of wickedness and sin, and blinded by all that is good and hopeful in the condition and the progress of the human race, bewails the present state of affairs and predicts woeful things for the future. In every cloud he beholds a destructive storm, in every flash of lightning an omen of evil, and in every shadow that falls across his path a lurking foe. But he forgets that the clouds also bring life and hope, that the lightning purifies the atmosphere, that shadow and darkness prepare for sunshine and growth, and that hardship and adversity nerve the race as the individual for greater efforts and grander victories. While we struggle toward greater efforts and grander victories, we're still being tested by hardships and adversity. The rich have been sitting at the banquet table, and the rest of us have been on the menu. So the gap has grown between the haves, the have-mores, and the have-nots. Between 1996 and 2006, CEO pay rose by 45%, while worker pay rose a mere 7%. The top 300,000 Americans collectively now have almost as much income as the bottom 150 million Americans. The top 20% of earners take over half the national income, while the bottom 20% get just 3.4%. Plutarch warned that an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. Black Americans, of course, are more likely to be poor than rich, and they are worse off than their white counterparts. Almost every social indicator, from birth to death, reflects black-white disparities. Infant mortality rates are 146% higher for blacks, chances of imprisonment 447% higher, rates of death from homicide 521% higher, lack of health insurance 42% more likely, proportion with a college degree 60% lower, and the average white American will live 5.5 years longer than the average black American. Just as President Obama's victory did not herald a post-civil rights America or mean that race had been vanquished, it could not and did not end structural inequality or racist attitudes. Indeed, there's evidence that it fomented them. President Obama is to the Tea Party as the moon is to werewolves. Within 1 month of President Obama's inauguration, Rick Santelli, a CNBC anchor, christened the Tea Party during a February 19, 2009 rant about poor black homeowners having homes and mortgages they could not afford. "It's time for another Tea Party," he bellowed. "What are we doing in this country will make Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin roll over in their graves." In fact, Thomas Jefferson wrote approvingly in 1811 of taxing only the wealthy, which meant, he said, the farmer will see his government supported, his children educated, and the face of his country made a paradise by the contributions of the rich class, without his being called upon to spend a cent from his own earnings. So from its inception, the Tea Party has been both ahistoric and racist. One of its heroines, Mary Rakovich of Cedar Key, Florida, said, "Obama is the most un-American president we have ever had." What is it that differentiates Barack Obama from every other American president? Glenn Beck refers to the health care bill as reparations, invoking slavery's angry descendants to imply incorrectly that most of the legislation's beneficiaries are non-white. The clear aim of the right wing is to repeal the progressive achievements of our lifetimes: the new health care bill, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the right to join labor unions, the Department of Education, the Environmental Protection Agency, and unemployment insurance. In a questionnaire for Tea Party, Steve Stivers, who defeated incumbent Mary Jo Kilroy in District 18 here in Ohio, said, "You could eliminate the Departments of Agriculture, Education, Interior, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, and others to return to a constitutionally pure government." The teabaggers may have bought energy to a Bush party, but at what price? They cost Republicans Senate and House seats in Delaware and probably Senate seats in Nevada and Colorado. Republicans will have to co-opt them or follow them. This, our third change election in a row, was in many ways politics as usual. 90% of blacks, 65% of Hispanics, and almost half of all women voted Democratic. The major difference between this go-round and 2008 was the age of the electorate. Almost twice as many 18 to 29-year-olds voted in 2008 compared to this year. And in 2008, 16% of all voters were over 65 compared to 25% this time. The two age groups were exact opposites in voting preferences. 6 of 10 young voters chose Democrats, and 6 of 10 seniors favored Republicans. But even among this whiter, older, more male, more conservative electorate, the mandate for change is murky. 48% want to repeal the health care bill, for example, while 47% want to leave it as is or expand it. The election may have been loud, but it certainly was not clear. What is clear is that our politics have been poisoned by armed and paranoid self-described patriots drawn from the Taliban wing of American politics. The real issue for many of our opponents today is that we now have a president whom they believe is guilty of governing while black. He was not on the ballot this month, but believe me, they had him in their sights. The teabaggers are 99% white. 52% of them, twice as many as the rest of the population, believe that too much attention has been paid to black people. They see the nation's demographics turning them into a minority, and they don't like it. They say they want their country back, and we ask, what was their country like? In their country, I couldn't eat at a lunch counter or cast a vote. I couldn't attend the University of Virginia, let alone teach there. These weren't the good old days for me. If Obama represents the end of America they know, I say, good for him. And if you tell me that the Teapag Party, the Pale Palin Party, has nothing to do with race, I'll tell you you've been drinking something and it isn't tea. The Civil War that freed my grandfather was fought over whether blacks and whites shared a common humanity. Less than 10 years after it ended, the nation chose sides with the losers and agreed to continue black repression for almost 100 years. The freed slaves found their former masters once again control their fate. American slavery was a human horror of staggering dimensions, a true crime against humanity. The profits it produced endowed great fortunes and enriched generations, and its dreadful legacy embraces all of us today. 246 years of slavery were followed by 100 years of state-sanctioned discrimination, reinforced by public and private terror, ending only after a major struggle in 1965, 2 years after Barack Obama was born. If you are 45 years old or older, and I can see some of you are, it is only in your lifetime that racial equality before the law became a reality, not before. For only 45 years have all black Americans been guaranteed the full rights of citizens. Only 45 years since legal segregation was ended nationwide. Only 45 years since the right to register and vote was universally guaranteed. Only 45 years since the protections of the law and Constitution were officially extended to everyone. We are now asked to believe that 200 years of being somebody's property, followed by 100 years of oppression in the South and discrimination in the North, can be wiped away by 4.5 decades of half-hearted remediation and one presidential election. We're now asked to believe that no permanent damage was done to the oppressors or the oppressed. We're asked to believe that we Americans are now a healed and whole people. The truth is that Jim Crow may be dead, but racism is alive and well. That is the central fact of life for every non-white American, including the President of the United States. Eclipsing income, position, and education, race trumps them all. So we have work to do. None of it is easy, but we've never wished our way to freedom. Instead, we've always worked our way. Today, we have much more to work with and must take heart that much has changed in America. A black man is running the country, a black woman is running Xerox, and a black man is the mayor of Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 white civil rights workers were murdered and buried in an earthen dam in 1964. There needs to be a constantly growing and always reviving movement across America if we're going to maintain and expand the victories such as reforming health care. Racial justice, economic equality, world peace, these were the themes that occupied Dr. King's life. They ought to occupy ours today. When I first started working 4.5 decades ago, there were 5 workers paying in the national retirement system for every retiree. Of course, I cannot possibly know who my 5 were, but there's a good chance their names would be Carl, Ralph, Bob, Steve, and Bill. When I retire, there are going to be 3 workers paying the retirement system for every retiree, and their names will likely be Tamika, Maria, and Jose. And I'm here to tell you that you better make sure that Tamika, Maria, and Jose have the best schools, the best health care, the best jobs, and the best protections against discrimination they possibly can. Thank you. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Julian Bond, civil rights leader, professor, scholar, politician, and writer. We will return to our speaker momentarily for the traditional City Club questions. Members and guests alike are welcome to attend City Club forums, and we hope that everyone listening will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the other many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Today is the KeyBank Endowed Forum, established with a generous gift from KeyBank to the City Club Forum Foundation. With us today from KeyBank is Karen White, Vice President of Community Relations. Will you please stand, Karen, to be recognized? Thank you, Karen and KeyBank. This forum is the annual Battisti Memorial Lecture in memory of Judge Frank and Gloria Battisti. We hold this forum in partnership with the Association of Judge Battisti's Law Clerks. This past year, we were saddened by the death of Judge Battisti's widow, Gloria Battisti. Gloria was a dear friend to many of the judge's law clerks and attended these City Club forums for many years. There are a number of family members here today, and we wish to extend our deepest condolences. We remember her fondly. We must also thank one of Greater Cleveland's prominent lawyers and CNN legal analyst, Avery Friedman. Among many honors, Mr. Friedman is a recipient of the Freedom Award presented by the NAACP. Avery, thank you for your help with today's program. Would you please stand and be recognized? We would also like to recognize Ophelia Averett, National Board Member for the NAACP, and George Forbes, President of the Cleveland chapter of the NAACP. Thank you. We welcome guests today at tables hosted by ACLU Ohio, Baker and Hostetler, Friends of Bracy Lewis, Kent State University, KeyBank, and the NAACP. Thank you all for your support. We are also pleased to host students at our forum today who are here as part of our City Club student program. Participation of these students is made possible by a generous contribution from the Fred E. Scholl Foundation. With us today are students from Cleveland Heights and Jane Addams High Schools. Will the students please stand to be recognized? And thank you for joining us. Now we would like to return to our speaker for a traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Development Director Cheryl Helden and Program Director Kerry Miller. First question, please.
Mr. Bond, you point out many of the challenges that are today facing America. And certainly one of the keys to those challenges, I believe, is the very high unemployment rate that we now have, close to 10%. There was a time during the Great Depression when Franklin Roosevelt had programs of WPA and CCC, which are very unlikely today under the composition of Congress. My question is, to what suggestions would you have, which President Obama and the Congress could use to try to alleviate the high employment rate?
Well, thank you for the question. I think I would suggest to President Obama, if I had his ear, well, first I would have said you should have made the original stimulus bill stronger, but you know, it's no use saying what you should have done. I would urge the Democrats in Congress in the lame duck session to see what they can do to stimulate the economy with a similar kind of stimulus program or jobs program or Rooseveltian ideas, although of course those are communist ideas, you recognize, and will not be tolerated by people in America today. But I would urge them to follow the Roosevelt pattern and work to the same effects using some of the same means if I had the presidency here.
Hi, I want to thank you for being here in Cleveland today.
Thank you.
There's a movie out called Waiting for Superman. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in the movie, it focuses on privatizing public education and blames teachers and teachers' unions for the problems, the struggles that are going on in public education today. And it states charter schools as the answer. How do you respond to teachers being blamed for the problems in public education?
I have not seen this documentary, but that doesn't stop me from having an opinion about it. And people in the audience here and in the listening audience who may not have seen it may be interested in looking at the New York Review of Books. In a recent issue, there's a article by Diane Ravitch, who some years ago was a critical thinker about public schools and a great defender of charter schools, but now has turned, and privatization, and now has changed her mind. And she writes eloquently about this documentary, about it, and about the failure of many charter schools to live up to the promises they seem to have, or seem to have gained in the public eye. And she writes that most of them are not as effective as the schools they replace in educating children, that in fact they're failing to do so. There are some that are very good and do a wonderful job, but they are by far the minority of schools in this category. And it seems to me, and this is not her thinking, mine, it seems to me this is kind of like a what can I say, a fad taken on by well-to-do people, stockbrokers and hedge fund managers, largely in New York, who think, boy, wouldn't it be great if I had a school. You know, some years ago, there was a dispute in Minnesota, where my wife is from, about Indian casinos. And somebody talked about the great new wine in Minnesota, white wine in Minnesota. And the white wine in Minnesota was, gee, I want a casino too. And you get the same idea about these charter schools that, you know, I don't want to denigrate the motives of people who think if I spend several millions of dollars, I can improve public education. In some cases, that may be what it takes. But it seems not to be so, and it seems so terribly unfair to blame teachers for the failures of public education. It's fairly well established that depending on the income level of the students, they do better or worse. And it's not just the teachers who make them do worse, and not just the kind of teaching to the test we've seen adopted in public school systems, largely because of No Child Left Behind, which really means no money left behind, doesn't it? At any rate, having not seen the movie, I can't make many comments about it except to report what I've read about it. And I invite anybody interested in a really good critique of the movie to read Diane Ravitch's article in the New York Review of Books. It's a wonderful take on this phenomenon. And here's another question.
Well, thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation. I have two concerns. One is that it seems that we're not in agreement that going backward would perhaps make us less competitive internationally. The second is that there's structural issues that you alluded to earlier in terms of racism, one of which I'm concerned with, which is the growing prison industry and the fact that almost the same number of black people in college exist in the prison system. So the problem seems to me, maybe because I'm at a university, what do we do to make the ideas circulate better? It seems to me that there's a problem with ideas and information. Perhaps I'm too optimistic. Circulate. I can't believe that a lot of people really know that so many people, so many children essentially, are in prison.
Thanks for the question. I think one of the problems we in the academy, I'm in the university system too, and teach university students, we in the academy don't always speak English. And so the audience we hope to reach isn't always sure what it is we're saying, what we're talking about, because we don't always speak as clearly as we should when we're talking about the things we've studied and presumably know a great deal about, and are in a position to offer some advice about how to overcome these things. So I think on my side of the table, if we would begin to speak a little more clearly than we have in the past and make our prescriptions and our predictions a little more elementary and understandable, I think our audience would be grateful for it and would be happy to hear it. But I think there is growing attention given to what's been called the school to prison pipeline. You know, the story, and I'm not sure if this is apocryphal or true, that someone said, who was in the prison building business, you tell me how many black kids are in the 3rd grade, and I tell you how many prisons we're going to need. Because I can predict that a great portion of those children are going to end up in prison. And you know, just last week, or election day, a week or so ago, in California, we lost an amazing opportunity to reduce the prison population astoundingly in a state that is just suffering badly with overpopulation of its prisons, and this is just crippling the economy of the state. California had a referendum on the legalization of marijuana, and the people who are arrested who smoke marijuana are both black and white. Black and white people smoke marijuana at roughly equal proportions. But the people arrested for smoking marijuana in California are almost entirely black. It's as though the white people were smoking marijuana inside and the black people on the street corner saying to police, look at me, I'm smoking marijuana. Now we know that's not true, but had this measure passed and it was defeated, and defeated largely because of the opposition of the unions representing which workers do you believe? The prison guard workers. The prison guard workers, their unions were strongly opposed to this idea because it's surely to reduce, had it passed, surely to reduce the number of prisons we require and reduce the number of prison guards we need. Well, I'm all for, prison guards. In fact, I have 3 sons, and 2 of my sons were prison guards. Sadly, this is a growth industry in Georgia where they live. But it ought not be a growth industry grown on the back of their friends and neighbors and their colleagues. And so California lost an opportunity to do something about this, and maybe it's something Ohio can take up in the future. Although I would think not, but it'd be a good idea. I mean, think about it. Why are we putting these people in prison for this minor crime? And it is a minor crime. And think of how much better off we'd be if we spent less money on prisons and more money on schools, for an example. Yeah.
How you doing, sir?
Okay.
1968, you was considered for the Democratic ticket as vice president. 2008, we saw the election of Barack Obama being the first black president. Now, recently, it's been in the media, you've seen things that with the symbolism of leaders, as far as black male leaders, is saying that achievement, as far as among African-American males, there's not achievement, there's not a sense of urgency among African-American males to achieve because a representative of Barack Obama as a president and you was considered as a vice president. So my question to you is, sir, is this. What is your advice to young African-American males today for us creating a second generation of leadership, and what are some of the things that you encourage your schools and stuff to encourage other students to achieve?
I'm not sure if I want to thank you for that question, because this is a difficult prescription. What would you say if I had the ear of black young men around the country? What would I say to them? I think I would tell them to study long, study hard, don't study wrong, try to achieve. Know that the degree to which they achieve in school is the degree to which money will be put in their pockets. That if they only graduate from grade school, their earning potential is very, very low. If they graduate from high school, it's slightly higher. If they graduate from college, it's even higher than that. If they graduate from a graduate school, it's even higher than that. So just a matter of common sense says, if you want to be a successful person, get an education. Now that seems like something simple that I'm sure has already been told to them by their mothers and fathers, their teachers in school and adults in the community, but apparently it's not hasn't sunken in as well as it might have done. But that's one thing I'd tell them. I'd also tell them that you just need to understand that there's a world out here that's waiting for you, and that if you push hard enough, you can join it. If you strive hard enough, you can join it, you can be a success in it. But part of it is up to you. It's not up to what other people do, it's up to you. And sometimes, you know, I have 5 children, sometimes they listen to everything you say, and sometimes nothing at all. But so I'd hope there'd be a time when they'd be attentive and would listen. So thank you.
Mr. Bond, it is a joy to listen to the sweep of your narrative, extending as far back in history as it does. I would ask you to juxtapose to your human rights narrative another whole movement that has accumulated strength in the last 100 years at least, and that is the environmental movement. Because I sense an odd opportunity to gain a new perspective on human rights, and it is exactly the one of looking at us biologically, taking a species perspective, and noting that what we have in common as human beings dwarfs what we have as differences. And I ask if you have found from the climate control debate, the whole notion of biodiversity, of environmental health, sort of the naturalist narrative that's beginning to gain strength. Do you see a mutual nourishment between that narrative and the one that you've brought to us today?
I would like to hope so. And I say hope so because even though I see in my mind's eye a connection between these movements, as well as other movements of people and other movements around the country and around the world, I see a natural connection between them. I don't think everyone does see that. In fact, some people feel that there's no connection at all, no connection to be made, and these are separate entities and they ought not cooperate in any kind of way. Well, first, that's just foolish, because to the degree these movements cooperate, to the degree their success will improve, because they'll be stronger, they'll have more supporters, and so on and so on. So it just makes sense that they ought to cooperate, and there's so much commonality. If you look at the environment, which I think some years ago, let's say 20-odd or more years ago, I think we thought of this as a middle-class phenomenon, something that attracted middle-class supporters who were concerned about trees and plants and flowers. And now I think it more often is a preoccupation of all sorts of people from all income areas, and particularly from people at the bottom of the income ladder who now are beginning to realize that they are the victims of this depredation of their environment caused by large economic forces that are beyond their control. And because they're beyond their control, they don't feel as if they can do anything about it, and these are cancer-producing, illness-producing, just destroying the environment in which they live, destroying their families, destroying their children. So they seem natural partners to me, and if I, again, in a previous question, if I had the ear of all these people, which I don't, I would tell them that it just makes common sense for them to cooperate, because together they're stronger and divided they're much, much weaker. It just makes sense.
Mr. Bond, how you doing, sir?
Okay.
My name is Bashir Jones, and as a graduate of Morehouse College, it's an honor to
I
have
knew you
the
were a Morehouse
opportunity.
graduate because you can always tell a Morehouse man.
But you can't tell them much.
That's right.
Here in our city, a lot of the young people, there's a sense of hopelessness that exists, whether they are African American, whether they are white, whether they are Hispanic. There's a sense of hopelessness that exists all across the city. And being that you were one of the founders of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee, there was this mindset that you all created during that time. What was it about those times, and what was it about you that didn't allow you to embrace this hopelessness and woe is me, and take it amongst yourself to say we're going to make a change in the South? And how can the young people who are here, we have great leaders here, like Arnold Pinckney and other great men who are here who have been a part of this movement here in our city. How can us, as the young people who are here, how can we take it to the next level and to relieve the hopelessness that exists within them?
I wish I had a quick answer to this, but it's one question that people have suffered with for decades and decades. April of this year was the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And we decided to have a reunion. And we chose to have it at Shaw University in Raleigh, which is where we were founded in 1960. And we sent out invitations, and we expected 300 people to come. 1,000 came. And I have to tell you, this was a high point of my life. This was more meaningful to me than my high school reunions, than my college reunion, than any reunion of any group I've ever been a part of, because the people with whom I worked in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were people with whom I developed such a close relationship that it was so great to see them again. And I knew at the age we are now that the likelihood of us doing this again was slim, if not impossible. But to see them again and to spend a weekend talking with them and reliving these experiences, it was just fabulous, just wonderful. And I began to ask myself, why is it, particularly, and these were black and white people together, but among the black people who were there, we were the last generation of black young Americans to engage in aggressive mobilization. Why is that so? Why is my generation, I'm 70 years old, why are we the last generation of African Americans to mobilize ourselves for social change? Not a single generation has done so since then. And the question, why not? Is it because of this hopelessness you described? That can't be true of the whole population. It can't be true that all of the people who, in successive generations, the people who are now 60, are now 50, are now 40, are now 30, or are now 20, are afflicted with this hopelessness. I don't believe that to be true. In fact, I know it's not true. Some of them are, but most of them are not. Some of them believe their hopes abound in this country. Opportunity abounds. The chance for an education, the chance to improve themselves, to grow and develop. I cannot imagine why it is this has not happened again, why this phenomenon has not been repeated again and again and again. Because for those of us who did it, it felt so good. It was so great. It was the best time. Everybody in this group considers this the best part of their lives. And the people in this group are widely diverse. They're different kinds of people. They went into different careers. They practiced different professions. Some great successes, lawyers or entrepreneurs of one kind or another, doctors. Some of them just school teachers, just, ordinary professions. But all of them considered this the high point of their lives. Why is it today's young people don't seek out an opportunity that might be just as rewarding to them? I don't know. But I wish they'd ask themselves the question and come up with some answers themselves, because I can't. But thank you. I knew a Morehouse man would ask a heavy question.
Hi, Mr. Bond. My question to you is, what do you feel is the most important bill or law you helped pass while in the Georgia legislature?
The most important bill or law I passed while I was in the legislature, probably a big fight I waged to reapportion the legislature, which of course should be on our minds right now, because we're nearing the time when we reapportion state legislatures all over the country, and the seizure by the Republican Party of many of these state legislatures means that the outcome of that reapportionment will be very different than it might have been had the opposite been true. So I went through an almost a year-long struggle to create 2 black majority congressional districts in Atlanta, in Georgia, one of which was created for me to run. And I ran, and some guy named John Lewis ran too, and for some reason he was successful and I was not. It was a great loss. He and I are good friends today, but that was the hardest thing and the thing I was most proud of. The other things I did, I think I passed a law making it easier for single parents to adopt children. And I was so happy about that, because I couldn't see why, they couldn't do so. And I found out most of my colleagues didn't see why they couldn't do so either, so they agreed. But the best experience I had in the legislature, I'll tell you this, and I think I'm through. Is there one more? All right. Is that I was new in the legislature and had been kept out a year because they threw me out. And so when I got in, my colleagues were kind of dicey around me, didn't know what to make of me. But I sat next to an older veteran, and he was a very nice man, and he told me if a bill came up that I didn't understand and he thought I should vote for, he'd say, "You should vote for this, Bond." Or if he thought I shouldn't vote for it, he'd say, you shouldn't vote for this. So a bill came up. It was to apportion some money for autistic children. This is a time when autism was not widely known. People didn't know what it was all about. And I wasn't quite sure about what this was about. I knew it was something to help children. So he said, Bond, you should vote for this. So I voted for it and it passed. But I noticed he voted against it. So I said, you told me to vote for it and I did. Why did you vote against it? He said, Bond, we have too many artistic children in Georgia. Thank you all very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to Julian Bond, civil rights leader, professor, scholar, politician, and writer. Thank you, Mr. Bond. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.